Hello, good afternoon and welcome. This afternoon we want to talk a little bit about our democratic program for democracy and parliamentary reform. First of all, to recap over what it is that we've done since 2011, because I think it's important sometimes to remind ourselves of the progress that there has been, and then also to move from there forward and to discuss what it is, to explain what it is that we intend to do. And I think we have progressed considerably since we first got elected in 2011 in the area of democratic and parliamentary reform. Very fast in the first term, from 2011 to 2015, where we set up a commission on democratic and political reform, and where we introduced a series of reforms which I'll go over now. And I think it slowed down in our second term, from 2015 to 2019, but that was purely because within 6 months of getting elected, or just over 6 months, we found ourselves with the Brexit issue thrust in our laps, and that really took away a lot of our time and drained away our time and resources into Brexit. But I know it's important, I think, to bear in mind that during a lot of that time, we actually faced one of the most hostile and aggressive Spanish governments that we've had since the days of General Franco. But there are a series, we introduced reforms nonetheless. I mean, one of them was introducing cabinet government, meeting as a cabinet every week. That in itself was new when we started to do it. We also established the process of direct democracy, where the Chief Minister takes questions from the members of the public directly, either on television or on radio. Again, that has worked very well, and it's also led to a leader of the opposition's direct democracy at the same time. So all that helps, and it holds politicians and governments to account. People who have issues can ring up and hold us to account. Also, the amount of public information which is available online now is more than ever before. And on the government website, there is a vast amount of information, something like 31 topics with 179 different tables covering all sorts of things, from health to housing to employment to taxation to contracts to tenders. All this vast information is available automatically online. It wasn't available online when I was a member of the opposition. And also, and I think importantly, we're looking at the architecture of democratic and parliamentary reform, is that the Freedom of Information Act has now been passed. That is now on our statute books. It was adopted by Parliament in July of 2018, assented to by the Governor in August of last year. And we said at the time that it was passed in Parliament that the Information Commissioner would now start meeting with different departments, carrying out these training courses, induction courses, and informing them as to what it is that they're required to do under the provisions of the Act. It's a huge piece of work, and it will involve a considerable amount of work on the part of the public administration. I mean, we now know that the first two departments will be the Archives and the Department of Education. Those are the first ones that will go through the process. And so the Act will be commenced very soon. It's happened a lot quicker than in the UK, where it took them 5 years, from 2000 until 2005, to commence the Freedom of Information Act. And in Malta, for example, it took 3 years, from 2008 until 2011, before the Act was fully commenced. So here, it will be probably just under a year before we see that legislation, well, just over a year, sorry, before we see that legislation come into the statute books. We also have and maintain the 20-year rule for the release of documents. That again refers to historic documents which are held by the archives and which people can now ask for or request if it is more than 20 years old. That was something which we established and which has been working very well since. We passed the Public Interest Disclosure Act, which will allow people to effectively behave like whistleblowers. If there's anything wrong inside the administration or inside wherever, they will be protected for making those disclosures public. We also increased the frequency of meetings of Parliament, and when we came in 2011, there were 12 in a term, roughly 3 a year, sometimes less. And we actually had a record of 33 meetings in our first term of office. That again came down in the second term because of Brexit, but we still managed 16, which is still more than we had when we started in government in 2011. As I mentioned earlier, the Commission on Democratic and Political Reform was established. The Commission made 39 recommendations to the Parliament. We decided in Parliament, on the advice of Sir Peter Caruana, who was then a backbencher, to refer all the recommendations to a select committee rather than adopt them there and then. And the select committee met and has been considering them in 2013 and 2014, and a number of those have been adopted already. So, for example, there are now more meetings of Parliament. More meetings of Parliament are now streamed live or televised. There are more motions which are tabled for debate in Parliament. More important statements and policy announcements are made in Parliament itself rather than in the media, as used to happen before. A new pension scheme was introduced for new members of Parliament, for new entrants. And importantly also, a new rolling register of electors is now in place. And that is in place for this election. We had to change the electoral registration law, and it allows people to, for example, to register online with their own ID cards, to verify the registration process, and to register from your home. But importantly also, it allows you to register up to 5 days before polling day, whereas before the register would have closed, for example, in June, and that was it. Nobody else could be added onto the register, no matter how entitled you were to be on it. If you couldn't be on it, you were out, and that was it. We've introduced a more flexible rolling register of electors, and that is now in place, and it's working for this election. We also introduced proxy votes. It wasn't possible before to vote by proxy. You could only vote by post, or you could vote in person, but those are the only two ways. We noticed that in European elections, proxy voting was popular. If somebody was going on holiday and you feared the ballot paper might not reach you and then have time to come back to Gibraltar and be counted, then you would vote by proxy in European elections. We now have adopted the same system for elections to the Gibraltar Parliament as well. We passed an act which regulated the holding and conduct of referenda in Gibraltar. Again, that was also a recommendation which the Commission had made. And the clerk has already started looking into the idea of using technology for elections in terms of vote counting and all that. And I've quite found a system which is secure and which works in the way we would like to, but that is now being investigated as well. So although the Select Committee did not complete its mission, because we spent all the time talking about backbenchers in those 4 meetings, the fact is about 20% of the recommendations made by the committee in 2013 have now been implemented by the government in one way or another. And in addition to the work done since 2011, we've taken steps to improve the way in which Parliament itself works. There was, while we had, before Brexit, a defined Chief Minister's question time. So every third Thursday at 3 o'clock, the Chief Minister would take questions. That was established in the agenda of Parliament forever. Then we set up a Parliament website. There was no website before we came in. And the website now contains very useful information, including Hansards going back decades. It includes information relating to elections, European elections, Gibraltar Parliament elections. So there's a wealth of information contained now in the Parliament website, including now the quicker production of Hansard. Again, when I was first elected in 1999, it took months to produce Hansard. Months meaning 8 or 9 months. I mean, I arrived just before a budget, and I did not have the budget of the previous year to be able to look at it. So it took a year. These things we now take for granted, and we have to remind people, otherwise they don't remember how things were. It took a year to produce Hansard, particularly in that case. Now it's produced within a few weeks. We entered into an arrangement with the Isle of Man Parliament. They produce it and send it back, and it's very quickly and very well done. As I mentioned, the Register of Electors allows you to now register online and to verify that registration online. We also modernized the Parliament chamber. It probably hadn't been touched since it first opened. There was famously a dead cockroach in one of the light panels on the ceiling, which had been there for more than 10 years. Yeah. And you can actually see the outline of a cockroach reflected from that. That's how bad it was. So I think certainly Parliament needed a facelift and it needed a refurbishment, and that happened as well. And in other areas, we transformed the planning process as well. And planning used to take place in a boardroom, in secret, behind closed doors. People didn't know the agenda, they didn't receive the minutes, they didn't know what was going to be discussed. We introduced something which, again, we now take for granted, but it's a public planning process, open to the press, open to the public. It means that the Commission has to discuss applications in front of the public, the press, the applicant and the objectors, has to take decisions in front of everybody as well. So it introduces a level of transparency which is far greater than what it used to have, considering it used to take place in secret. So we also plan to discuss in the Select Committee on Parliamentary Reform that we want to re-establish after the election, the remaining recommendations of the Commission, which have not been implemented or discussed as yet, the expansion of Parliament, which, although it was not a recommendation of the Commission, it was the only issue that we spent a lot of time discussing in the previous 4 meetings, But that we intend to discuss as well. Our policy is very clear. Our policy is not to expand Parliament. It's a policy of the GSD. But we heard their arguments in the Select Committee, and we decided to pursue that. But I think it was misunderstood at the time. I think people thought the government and the opposition were generally trying to ride roughshod this idea of increasing the size of Parliament. So certainly, if there will be a discussion, but this will only happen with a full process of public consultation to make sure that the public are aware and on board of with what it is that may or may not happen. We need to finalise as well the Code of Conduct for Members of Parliament and the Code of Conduct for Ministers. I mean, those are finished in the sense that they are written, but they have to be formally approved and ratified by the Select Committee, or indeed amended by the Select Committee if they wish to make amendments to it. And the new question, which has arisen quite recently, is the question of funding political parties, which has never really been an issue here. I mean, parties have been funded by members, traditionally, but the question of state funding of parties has now reared its head. In the UK, there is a combination. There are private people who make private donations to political parties, but there's also state funding of parties as well. The Electoral Commission has policy development funds, which it gives to political parties with more than 2 sworn-in members of Parliament, and they split that equally amongst all the parties, and £1 million, and have another £1 million, which they give proportionally depending on the number of people that each party or group represents. And apart from that, there's also the short funding, which was this funding of opposition parties devised by when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister. And when he was in opposition, he realised that oppositions couldn't really do very much with the resources that they had. So when he came back into government, he actually passed a law to fund the opposition parties. It's known as short funding, after Edward Short, the minister who introduced the legislation. And they received millions of pounds of funding, which are used for researchers and special advisors and people of that nature. So that's another area which will be discussed and looked at in more detail in the Select Committee. In terms of the physical aspect of Parliament, we intend to provide a lift. This has been now on the agenda for a very long time. It hasn't happened for heritage reasons. We had a number of discussions with the Heritage Trust as to where the lift should be located, and we've determined in the end to put it where it originally was going to go, which is on the western side, the piazza side of the building. We looked at internal lifts, we looked at chair lifts, we looked at the stairwell at the external side on the Main Street side, and really we've carried out intrusive works. It's really not, we cannot really put it anywhere else, and we believe that there should be access to people with disability to the Parliament chamber. So that is in a manifesto and will happen. We intend to establish a select committee on exiting the European Union. We've had one. I mean, the reality is that despite what you hear about politics and about politicians, is that it worked pretty well in the sense that we met with the opposition parties more than 20 times. We briefed them on different issues as they were happening. So in terms of imparting information, of them giving us their views or opinions or suggestions, I think the format worked. So we intend to establish one. If we're out of the European Union, then there'll be a committee to discuss a future relationship with the European Union as well. And we intend to also set one up on the Constitution. If we leave the European Union, then the Constitution of Gibraltar will need to change. I mean, we believe it needs to change anyway, whether we leave or whether we stay. But the EU is in our Constitution in many ways, so that would need to be removed and altered. So there would need to be constitutional change together, first of all, with the political parties and the public here in Gibraltar, and then with the United Kingdom government as well. We also intend to review the workings of the Development and Planning Commission. I mean, we've done so much, but there's always more that can be done, and you need to see whether what you've done so far can be improved in any way. So we're not saying it's perfect, we're saying it's better than what it was, but there may still be room for improvement. And we'll appoint, as we have over the last 2 terms, a minister with specific responsibility for the delivery of the manifesto. I've been the one who's been handling that for the last 2 terms. We believe our manifesto is what people use to hold us to account. It gives the citizen direct accountability with the government that they elect. And we, in the first term, had a very ambitious manifesto with over 500 commitments, 536, I think it was, and we've implemented over 90% in that particular time. And we got a vote of confidence from the electorate in 2015, plus a vote for our new manifesto, which, although we haven't fully implemented it in the sense as much as the other one, I think it's certainly well over 80% of it is in place or ongoing already. So we've actually progressed it pretty well, despite the delays caused by Brexit. And we also intend to review the fundamental rights section of the Constitution of Gibraltar. that there is a provision in there which allows that to happen without the United Kingdom and without a major constitutional conference. You just need the approval of Her Majesty, as it were, before you start the process. But there are sometimes in law and in practice changes to human rights as time goes by, and we think those changes should be enshrined in the fundamental rights section of the Constitution. So in short, I think Gibraltar has progressed considerably in the right direction since 2011. There is still work to be done. I think we would have moved further still and further forward had it not been for the level of work generated by our proposed departure from the European Union, and we certainly look forward to a renewed mandate from the electorate to be able to tackle all these issues that we said we'd like to do. So thank you very much.